Welcome to Light Warrior Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Kan, author of the #1 best-selling book, Sensitivity is Your Superpower: How to Harness Your Gifts, Fulfill Your Purpose, and Create a Life of Joy. And if you are a sensitive soul and you're new to our channel, I'd love for you to hit subscribe. And if you don't already have a copy of my freebie, which is called the Sensitive Soul Empowerment Guide, the 3 ways of navigating your way to more peace, positivity, and personal power, you can get it at sensitivesoulguide.com. It's absolutely free for you to download. Now, today I have a very special guest, and how I found out about the special guest was through my staff, actually. One of my staff, she said, "You gotta listen to this guy." She said he's talking about the CSF, and I thought, well, that's interesting because I'm a medical doctor, right? And I'm thinking, well, what do I know about the CSF and what don't I know? But it had to do with spirituality and consciousness, and I was like, oh, I'm really interested now. Because here's the thing: over the last few years, as I've having these communications with Source, helping people with their self-healing process, some communications have come through a lot actually around water, but not just any water, water in the body, and the crystalline structure, communication. Some of you have remembered that I interviewed Gerald Pollack, the fourth phase of water, and asked him questions that he couldn't answer because it was more spiritual, but it was very entertaining. There's just so many things we don't understand about the water in our bodies. And here, this was specific to CSF. So our guest today is Dr. Mauro Zappaterra, and he's an expert in this field talking about the CSF. It's not just about the liquid that surrounds your brain and just washes it over or just takes toxins away. That's kind of more or less what I was told in medical school. And, we would poke holes into, the spine. I know it sounds terribly violent, but, sometimes people are really sick, and we'd poke holes in the spine, drain the CSF a little bit so we can see if there's an infection or is there inflammation or something that we, try to kill with antibiotics. But now we're like, wow, this is a lot more than just a bunch of water, and fluid just washing over the brain. So we're going to talk about breath work today. We're going to talk about consciousness, how that all relates, source connection, because again, some of the, communications I've had is this when we have so-called ascension upgrades, or when the whole planet seems to shift energetically, that like energy can come down through the crown, and of course that's going to affect the CSF and or vice versa. I'm super curious of what our guest thinks about that. So let me tell you a little bit more about him. So Dr. Mauro Zappaterra obtained his MD PhD from Harvard. He's a board certified in physical medicine and rehab with a focus on optimizing human performance, increasing awareness, and decreasing suffering. He's been practicing mindfulness since 1998 and teaching mindfulness to his patients with chronic pain since 2018. He's the director of multidisciplinary care at Synovation Medical Group. He has led the Awakening Awareness Program for the Emerging Sciences Foundation, which you can find on YouTube. He's published numerous scientific papers and medical book chapters on the CSF, disability, and pain management. He's also published some books, so we may have to have him back for this because I'm super curious about this. Books for children, including I Am, All One, and All Love. Every time I say those 3 words, I just get chills in my body. So awesome. And he's also published Close Your Eyes, What Do You See? With his then 7-year-old son, which is a story about imagination and intention. And we'll link some of the links to some of his books below wherever you're watching this or listening to this. And so he's continuing to help people with chronic pain investigate the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, and integrating this research and the whole consciousness field. So this is super exciting for us. So Dr. Zappaterra, thank you so much for being on the show. We're really excited to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So tell us about you. Obviously, you're very learned. So you don't only just have an MD, but you have an MD and PhD, and from Harvard, no less. So how does somebody like with that background kind of get into what you're into now?
um, it's a great question. Well, I was already sort of interested, even as a child, about who we were as human beings, and what this physical body, how this physical body came to be in essence. I was very interested in like development and how an egg, when it gets fertilized with a sperm, starts to just undergo this process, and it just seemed like totally like I'm like there's no way that like it's just all physical, and there's got to be some information that we yet don't understand or have tapped into. And scientifically, you talk about sensitive souls. Many people probably from who are sensitive souls probably have a sense of that energy, but we don't have the instruments yet that from a scientific perspective that can like measure it like an X-ray does, or an MRI. We're getting there, and there's definitely people like myself who are interested in getting research to find those instruments. But I also say, it's your own sensitive soul is the instrument, so you are the instrument. And if we have 10 million sensitive souls and we have 10 million instruments that can relay this information and relay this message, um, and so just a really beautiful thing. So I was always interested in this sort of idea, or this question of how do we become who we are, and what is it, and what happens when we die, and things like that. And then also how our mind and bodies interact, and how our heart and brain interacts. And I grew up in California, and so it was sort of like, oh well, you go and you learn medicine or science or something like that, which is fine. But my mom always had a stint towards like myofascial work, shiatsu, massage, acupuncture, sort of Chinese medicine, looking at meridians, looking at energy points. And there was just sort of just sort of made sense to me. And so when I had like growing up, when I was a kid and got injured playing sports or mountain biking, and I had back pain, I'd go to an acupuncturist and look at like stressors in my life that occurred. Not only was I involved in an injury, but what was sort of mentally prone in my life that would um, that would open up my body to then be injured in essence. And and a lot of it was also when I met my wife, who was very interested in healing, and we decided to, kind of, in essence, our soul partners decided to partner up and be together, and create children together. And we have a similar vision of essentially, how do we work with people to help decrease suffering and improve quality of life, from a holistic, multidimensional perspective. She's definitely more, let's say, she does craniosacral therapy, biodynamic craniosacral therapy, and she works with children. Um, and so she's definitely more, let's say, biodynamic in nature in her work than I am. But yet, it all, everything informs everything else. So it is what it is. Um, when I got to medical school, for instance, I knew that I would be learning anatomy and physiology, but I remember flying from LA to Boston, and the book I wanted to read was Carolyn Mace's Anatomy of the Spirit, to understand, what are other views. I was going to understand the Western view of the body, but I needed to understand other views of the body in terms of energetically, what were other views of the body, so I could get a more broad understanding of it. And at the end of the day, that's really what it is. It's just an inquiry of who we are, and who I am, and who we all are. And that drove that drove a lot of my relationships with people. That drove a lot of my interest in going into medicine and doing research. Um, and then continuing on the path with my wife to still investigating our true nature and ourselves, and who we are, is there any way to be totally accepting and in the flow of the present moment, but yet work on intentions and our energetic bodies such that we can, maybe, is there any way to intentionally manifest something? And we're kind of in that an N of one uh, process at this time, which is fun. And I kind of think that's what life is about, to be honest with
Right. I like that. The N of one, because people these days are throwing the word science around on social media like, you know, where's the science? What's the science? Follow the science. Don't follow the science. The science is corrupt, blah, blah, blah. Like, and then at the end of the day, it's what's our personal experience. It is our life after all. And if we truly are creators, then that actually it holds a lot of weight. It isn't necessarily about what everybody else thinks or is
exactly.
experiencing.
N of one, N of one. Yeah, and so I felt like in order to like one of my things is sort of like using language to be able to communicate to numerous groups, right? So if you want to talk about the solar plexus, well, we can talk to the solar plexus to people who work with the chakras and energy healers, but we can also talk to the solar plexus to neurosurgeons, right?
Mm,
And so now we have the language. Can we now use the language that now we can get the energy healers to discuss with the neuroscientists and the neurosurgeons, right? um, could there be an opening in people's minds that maybe a plexus of um, that maybe a plexus of neurons, of the nucleus of the neurons, could actually have some sort of energetic quality to it that people could actually sense in the body. Is that totally out of the realm of the way that neurons work or the way that energy is perceived? And when I kind of put it that way, it's sort of like, well, no. Okay, well, that's what energetically then we're feeling as the solar plexus, not only internally, but maybe do you think that there could be somebody who puts a hand, which is also a measurement tool, let's say, and actually can feel the energy emerging from somebody's solar plexus? And so you kind of have discussions that way, where we know that we could put EEGs on somebody's head and monitor the electrical activity of the brain, right?
right.
Or magnetic magnetic electrodes for the heart. So why could somebody not be able to do that with the hand for the solar plexus? Just and so those are the types of dialogue to kind of to
Mm,
in my opinion, to sort of to bridge everybody, to bring everybody together, and not have these separations, and then also understand how science was truly done, right? When you spend 5 years in a lab or longer, um, added up with all my undergraduate work was probably 9 years in a lab, doing doing sort of hardcore science, or all that stuff. You understand how it's done, and so you don't see it as a stagnant process. It's not, oh,
right.
trust the science. The number of scientific papers that have been written that are wrong is huge.
Yeah, thank
And
you for
so
saying that.
therefore, like, the number of people who have been investigated for scientific fraud at Harvard, now at Stanford, the president is being investigated for, oh, I didn't know that my grad student, copied that image, or whatever it might be. It's enormous. And,
Mm,
and, and, I think there was actually a science paper that said, over 50% of the experiments that are published in peer-reviewed journals cannot be reproduced.
mm,
And so you understand how difficult it is, how set and setting is so important, and how these discoveries, right, trust the science, really comes about. And then I think when you understand, it's sort of like, oh, well, we can be open to then a discourse, a dialogue
yes.
of a process that's occurring, as opposed to, well, this paper was written in 93 and this is what that said, and therefore we have to, well, how much has evolved and changed, and as we do get more sensitive tools, what were we really assaying back then compared to now, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of had an understanding of, all right, I get how science is done, and then be able to investigate the science, and say, every new paper starts with a new hypothesis. So for somebody to make a hypothesis, right, and then you have to say, do we have the tools that we can measure whatever we're trying to measure with? What's the effect size, right? If you have a tiny effect
Hmm.
size, but over time it increases. Somebody would say, well, would you want something that has an effect size of 1%. Well, in clinical medicine, we probably say, it doesn't do anything, right? Well, it's so hard to study an effect size of 1% because you might not see a change in 3 months.
Right.
But over 30 years, wow, I don't know, 1% seems like you could skyrocket that. And, if intention has even a 1% effect on manifesting something, then why not bring that part of the equation in? So kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there. I
No,
apologize.
no, no. I love it. I love it because I've got the medical background, and when you said 1%, the first thing that popped up was sort of like the flu shot. You know, like in
Yeah.
terms of relative versus an absolute risk, right? Like people are shown the relative risk, but not the absolute risk. So they go, oh my gosh, I have to get my flu shot because it's going to save my life, And it's like, well, actually, the absolute risk is actually really, really tiny. And also, we don't measure. Like I have patients or clients now who are, have been on multiple medications for many, 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 many years, and maybe somebody else says, well, I don't want to take you off the medication because of XYZ. And when I ask, I said, well, ask your doctor if they have any scientific data or evidence about being on a proton pump inhibitor for 20 years. Or maybe being on the proton pump inhibitor and the cholesterol medication and the diabetes medicine simultaneously. Show me that paper. Well, it doesn't exist, right? You and I know it doesn't. So this whole science thing, like I love your perspective of it, it being that fluid and being open. Some of the work I've really appreciated is like Gary Schwartz, some of his work on Reiki and different energy healing, and Beverly Rubik, and the whole the phantom leaf thing. I'm not sure who did that. Multiple people did, but I just thought that was so fascinating about how there could be this structure of the leaf that's light when there is no leaf, right? Like that just blew me away the first time that I saw it. Now, I'm curious, being California, you guys have to say a little bit more open in general than those of us on the East Coast about certain things. So, how was it for you going through medical school and residency with this? Hey, I'm going to read this Carolyn Mace book.
I maybe I just associated with the right people, but it it was really well supported. I told my PI when I was doing my PhD that I wanted to integrate. I was studying the cerebrospinal fluid at a Harvard lab. He was Howard Hughes investigator, Dr. Christopher Walsh, and studied brain development. And I told him, I said, while I'm doing this, my wife and I also want to fly out to Boulder, Colorado, for 4 days every 2.5 months to study biodynamic craniosacral therapist and biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And he's like, great, look, you're gonna have to finish your PhD. And that was the end. That was sort of like the end of the thing was you're
Wow,
gonna have to do a PhD. You know what I mean? Like here at Harvard. So you might be extending your PhD, but but he gave me that opportunity, right, to do that.
that's amazing.
Um, and so I really found people who were supportive. And I remember proposing him my PhD thesis, and um, he was more excited than anybody else, and he had done all this really intense research on brain development and how neurons travel in the brain, and nobody had really thought about the fluid. And
Hmm.
and it just, the light bulb went off for both of us. And he really wanted me to find my PhD thesis. So I remember sending him an email, and i I thought it was a good email, but I left and I went to go get a cup of coffee. And then he went to come find me because he wanted to talk to me in person because he thought it was such a great idea. And he was, sort of, and he couldn't find me, and then he was frustrated that he couldn't find me. So he went from this like excited to like frustrated to, then I came back. I sort of come back like strolling with this cup of coffee. He's like, where were you? I'm like, oh shoot, like, I just went downstairs to get a cup of coffee. He's like, I was looking for you everywhere, man. Like, what a great email. Yes, let's do it. How do you think we could do it? And I was like, well, and then it, just kind of took off from there. And there's still the postdoc that I worked with, who has an entire lab, and she works on the cerebrospinal fluid at Children's Hospital, and in Boston. And it's just a really remarkable sort of story. So I really sort of, I think, surrounded myself with people who were supportive. Um,
Mm,
it
nice.
wasn't like that initially, but it became that way. So it's sort of like, as I started to ask the right questions of myself and sort of realign with my maybe purpose, I don't know,
Yep.
those people sort of started appearing, and it's just sort of like magically, I think, happened. Um, and I still remember I still remember struggling. And there's all these people that show up in your life, right? But I still remember struggling in lab and just being really frustrated, because that's what a lot of research is, in the lab. And you're struggling because I always say it's a practice on failure. And
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah, I was a biochemist and molecular biologist, and I did the first PCR in Canada, and it was freaking crazily failure after failure after failure. So hard, not like the machines we have now.
there you go. Yes, right. You're there, hand, like, you're using your hand, right? Okay, now I got to transfer this. Now I got to transfer this. You have
This
your little
water
finger
bath,
on it.
this temperature water bath. Oh my gosh,
Exactly.
everything degraded. Shoot.
Um, so I was super frustrated. I was the only one in this like 26-person lab doing, the CSF. And then this medical student comes in, says, I read about, I like read about your work, and I want to work on the CSF. And I was like, really? Like, you want to help me? Yeah, yeah. Like, let's work. Can we work together? Can I help you? Like, what do you need to?
Wow.
And it was like, wow. Okay. And we just like became a super, we called it the CSF team, and became a super team.
Oh,
And then this postdoc joined, and then we had a visiting professor from another lab join, and it just started growing slowly like that. And you go from one person doing the work to all of a sudden 4 or 5 people doing the work, and it starts to things start to move a little faster. So that was really cool too. Um,
wow, that is great. And I just wanted to pause here for a moment just to share with people your website, which is holdingspace.com. Love that. Holdingspace.com, where you can find Dr. Z here. And so tell us about the CSF. What sorts of things for people that are brand new, like, what the heck is a CSF, right? Like what are some of your discoveries if you could share with us?
Yeah, so let's just start out with, the CSF is a clear fluid that bathes your brain on the outside, your spinal cord. So imagine, a fluid that is between your skull and your brain, and it all the way, so around your spinal cord, in your spinal canal, your spinal cord is bathed in this fluid, and it goes all the way down to your sacrum. So we're all sitting, if you're sitting on your sacrum right now, we're all sitting on like a pool of cerebrospinal fluid. It also, just anatomically, it's in the inside of our brain. So there's these cavities or spaces called ventricles on the inside of our brain, and this fluid is what is what is inside these cavities. And then in the middle of your spinal cord. So if you can imagine the spinal cord sort of like a donut with a hole in the middle. Um, the hole in the middle is filled with cerebrospinal fluid as well. And so essentially, the way that we sort of learned about the cerebrospinal fluid was, yeah, it had some nutrients and some electrolytes and stuff like that. But it was mostly providing buoyancy to the brain and the spinal cord. And it was sort of as a shock absorber. If you got hit, if I hit my head or
Right.
something
That's
like
what
that.
we were told. It's a shock
Yep.
absorber.
Yep. It would be like a fluid shock absorber between the brain and the skull. And so therefore try to decrease the impact of any head injury or spine injury or anything like that. Um, and so so that's just anatomically. Over the last, so this research really took off in about 2006, 7, 8, 9, when myself and others really started sort of diving into the cerebrospinal fluid in terms of its functional capacity and what it did. And so if we take it back and look back embryologically, when we are developing in our mother's womb, um, initially, we are a single layer sheet, like if you could imagine like a layered cake, right? We are that single layered cake, and that single layer cake becomes, let's say my favorite flavor is vanilla, right? Let's say the vanilla, then it becomes strawberry and chocolate. So that single layer cake becomes three layers, and that all those layers are actually bathed in fluid. Um, and there's a process that's called neurulation, when one of the layers starts to sort of invaginate, and then what happens is that the layer invaginates and then the top of it fuses, and this is the beginning of development in the embryo. And on the side that it invaginates, that's what people know as the amniotic fluid. So that's bathing the cells of those of that sheet, and it invaginates, and then it folds up and it sort of creates this tube, right? And that tube is what's known as the neural tube. So that starts the process of creating this body plan, and symmetry of right and left. We have a neural tube, we have a midline with the neural tube forming. We have a midline, and then where the brain is forming, there's a lot of cells that migrate up to that area and start to develop the brain, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when we're that single layer sheet, on the outside there, that's the amniotic fluid. When we fold in and close that body plan, now we're closed. Inside, remember I said it was like a donut, right? Inside the space of the donut, that now differentiates and becomes cerebrospinal fluid. So in embryologic development, in all of us, this has happened to all of us, right? When our body, first of all, all our cells are bathed in fluid initially. Then, as we form this body plan, which becomes the spinal cord in the brain, on the inside of this tube is the cerebrospinal fluid that differentiates itself from the amniotic fluid on the outside. Okay, that now is called cerebrospinal fluid. As we close and start to develop, there's more fluid then that comes into the brain, et cetera, et cetera. But all the stem cells, what we learned from our research is, if you can imagine sort of like a canal like this, and this being fluid, all the stem cells are around and are bathed in this fluid in each one of us. So as your body needs to expand and grow, right? The stem cells need to decide, well, do I divide and make another stem cell, or do I divide and then differentiate and become a neuron? Well, if it divides and stays as a stem cell, then it stays close to the cerebrospinal fluid. If it actually divides and decides to become a neuron, it actually moves away from the cerebrospinal fluid and can differentiate into a neuron. And so what we found is, just embryologically, that the cerebrospinal fluid was providing some sort of information to the developing brain for this stem, well, we called it a stem cell niche. So it provided an environment for the endogenous cells of the developing brain and spinal cord to remain as stem cells. And it was just through the cerebrospinal fluid. So then the question became, well, wow, this is an incredible fluid. We never really thought of it that way, et cetera, et cetera. What then are the molecules, right? Because then we got to, like, in terms of science, we have to like deconstruct it and go into, let's find the one molecule. And I'm saying, well, it's not one molecule. It's this fluid that's doing it. But in terms of like getting a PhD or anything, like, you want to find one or two molecules that have been, sort of like, that are instrumental in this process. And so we did a lot of studies and looked at, and found some specific molecules that really changed with time and changed with developmental process of what was happening with the brain. And we're able to sort of manipulate it in such a way to show that, yeah, the cerebrospinal fluid actually provides this information, whatever it is that's holding the information, through growth factors or hormones or molecules that help retain this stem cell niche. And then others were doing other work, like showing that the cerebrospinal fluid, with movement of the cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, we could that it could actually guide where the neurons were going to develop. So based on the movement of the fluid in the ventricles, that would actually direct where the stem cells would go and then where the neurons would send their projections. So really, really, really cool studies. Um, After I left the lab, some people then did research on it and showed that, I'm not sure if you've seen those studies where they take elderly people and they, or mice, and they infuse young blood, and they show that, antioxidants increase, and people feel more vibrant and stuff like that. And now it's actually happening as a clinical practice here. um, but now then they did the study of replacing sort of old CSF with new CSF, and they showed that with the embryonic CSF, you're increasing neurogenesis, so you're increasing the ability to make new neurons and memory cells and things like that. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so some really neat stuff has come out of it biologically. Um, and then in humans, the biggest finding was that, contrary to what we initially thought, right? So this is sort of like, oh, it's housed in the ventricles. And then as we get more sensitive instruments, we can do, we're doing studies on something else, and we see, wait a second, we're actually seeing cerebrospinal fluid that's now in the brain, in the
Hmm.
actual tissue. Right? So
Hmm.
what we were taught in medical school, right, is that
Right.
it's around the brain, it's in these ventricles, it's down the
Right.
central canal of the spinal cord, and it's around the outside of the spinal cord, but that it didn't get into the brain. And then what we discovered is actually, oh wow, well, now what happens is that we discovered that the cerebrospinal fluid can actually flow into the what we call the parenchyma, or the tissue of the brain. And now
Mm.
you're going, oh, whoa, when does this happen, right? Well,
Hmm.
just by looking at the contents of the cerebrospinal fluid, even before these studies came out, when we looked at all the molecules that were in the cerebrospinal fluid, what was stunning to me was how much it looked like extracellular matrix. So the fluid, how much it looked like extracellular matrix, the extracellular matrix being like the tissue that is holding all of our cells together. Okay. Now the fluid, right? When we just analyzed the fluid had molecules in there, had proteins in there that were exactly like the extracellular matrix. And so I called it, it's sort of a less differentiated, sort of like a liquid matrix. It's sort of like, oh, here's the liquid matrix. Then it goes into the physical matrix, and then we can use these things to make the cells and the tissues and stuff like that. But there's sort of this process of going from liquid to physical, liquid to
Yes.
back and back, right? So it's not just one way, it's back. It's sort of like this
Oh.
morphing, hey, I'm a liquid, and now I can manifest into a physical entity, but I can also demanifest into the liquid,
Mm.
right? So I was like, oh well, it's just like a liquid matrix, but it's in the middle of the brain. It's in these ventricles. And so when they figured out that, oh wow, the fluid is actually coming into the brain tissue itself, it made perfect sense, because now it's actually making up the fluid that the extracellular matrix is being held in. And this fluid is now sort of traversing through the brain tissues and cleans out our brain, and it cleans out the brain of all its toxins that build up during the day. So the specific study was that they showed that there is this pulsatile nature of cerebrospinal fluid through the brain tissue when we sleep. And believe it or not, this was like in 2013 or something. This was like one of the first studies that showed why sleep was important for sort of like, oh, we figured out why sleep was important. That it may actually clean out toxins and debris by some process that allowed what they called them sort of like, gates and channels and stuff like that. It
Hmm.
allowed these gates to open up. And when the gates opened up during sleep, that the fluid could now come into the brain tissue, and you get this like pulsating sort of into the brain tissue and clean out all the fluids, and then it'd be brought back into your venous sinuses and brought back into your liver and heart and gotten rid of. You pee it out, or it takes care of all the proteins. um, and so that was really cool, right? But anybody who knows any of this work is like, well, there's a lot of like people who don't need a lot of sleep, so there's got to be other mechanisms by which this fluid can actually like traverse the brain, right? So um that just like makes perfect sense. So my hypothesis back in like 2014 was essentially almost any parasympathetic state or state that brought some sort of activation to the cerebrospinal fluid was going to open up these channels, and we were going to get this circulation to occur. So
Mm.
imagine, just like any, the river of our soul, the river of our body, the internal river that's flowing within us all. This fluid is moving, and it just moves naturally. Okay, so just like any flowing river, some rivers move more quickly than others, and some are more stagnant. And when they tend to be more stagnant, there tends to be a buildup of debris
Debris, right?
algae and insects and stuff like that. And so imagine that being the same for our fluid, our river within.
Mm.
That if we're not getting this river to flow with, let's say, just proper sleep, if you're not doing anything else, um, that you may actually be predisposed to building up toxins in your brain, having increased likelihood of headaches, migraines, um, neurodegenerative diseases, dementia, etc. And so
Right.
we
Those
sleep.
neurofibrillary tangles, possibly.
Exactly. Exactly. The amyloid plaques build up, things like that. So that then brings us into, so then they wanted to see, oh wow, how does the cerebrospinal fluid work, and how does it move, and how does it actually, how do we get this fluid to move? And so now what people are doing is, we've studied now breath work, for instance. Um, they've studied ultrasound. So directed energy
Hmm.
frequencies to the fluid. So
Okay.
imagine, right? So now what we're talking about is, um, oh, there may be conditions that occur when the fluid is stagnant, they tend to build up. So what we need to do is figure out ways of actually increasing the flow of this fluid. And it actually turns out that with inspiration and expiration and breathing techniques, we can actually increase the flow of this fluid.
Mm.
Very specific research has shown this. It's pretty cool. Very,
That
very,
is very cool.
very cool. Um, they've shown that ultrasound can do it, so directed ultrasound. And they've shown that actually exposing people to like flashing a grid of flashing lights has been able to do it. So now you're thinking about, okay, breath work. I'm looking at energy, right? It's not just going to be ultrasound. I guarantee you it's going to be a ton of different other energies. We've
Yes.
got to look at different light, right? We got to look at different light energies. We've got to look at different sound energies. We got to look at movement, right? My own movement, dance, yoga, inverted postures,
Right.
whatever it might be. We got to look at different, breathing techniques and breath hold techniques and things like that, and releasing the breath or holding on to the breath, all getting this fluid to flow.
Ooh, I wonder whether Wim Hof has anything, whether they did any studies on it or
Yeah, so
related
we
to.
actually just published a hypothesis paper that was just published on Wim Hof. We
Oh,
didn't
we did.
actually do, what we were trying to do is generate interest to get funding, but we published a hypothesis paper specifically looking at that. Is Wim
Mm.
Hof method activating the flow of this fluid and subsequently decreasing neurodegenerative diseases? That would be that, that's sort of the hope for the study. There is a group that has already looked at not necessarily the cerebrospinal fluid, but what they did is they looked at amyloid beta, which is one of the proteins that builds up in Alzheimer's disease. And they looked at, after doing breath work, can we show that we're actually decreasing amyloid beta in the body? And the best way that they could actually do it was measuring amyloid beta in the blood. And they
Oh, okay.
actually showed that um, after breath work, I forget like how long or for what length duration the breath, but that they actually showed decreased amyloid beta in the blood after
Wow.
performing breath work. They haven't looked yet at the cerebrospinal fluid or scanning the brain or anything like that, but those are studies that are definitely coming up. So that's purely from a totally like we would, if we want to call it right, scientific medical perspective,
Oh, yeah. So there's
right? So we
other
haven't even
consciousness stuff.
touched.
Right. The other, well, let me
We
ask you a
haven't
couple
even
things.
touched.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't hear about, I'll personalize it. I didn't hear about through medical school, which was forever ago, was about glymphatics. So is what you're talking about related to, or is the glymphatics of the brain?
Yes, that's just the system that it's called because it's created by the glial cells in the brain. And so instead of lymphatics, which we
Right.
know from lymph drainage and lymph massage and stuff like that, they named it glymphatics, sort of to mimic the same thing but happening or similar thing but happening in the brain.
Ah, okay, okay. Well, and we'll kind of veer the conversation to the whole consciousness thing now. We're doing this bridge, and I'm being an MD and an energy healer. I tend to be kind of one of those bridges to try to explain things on both realms. Some of the messaging that I was getting around water was about that the structure of water, the consciousness of water has a huge impact, on us, not just because it's in our bodies, but throughout the whole world. So just curious, what your theories are, what things you're looking at related to that.
Yeah, so I think you're right on the right track in essence because the cerebrospinal fluid is 99% water. So now, if you just kind of take everything that you know about water and possibly superimpose it onto the cerebrospinal fluid, now you have an entire different system. So for instance, there are there's many people who are crystallizing water with certain as water is exposed to certain energies and seeing that the
Right.
crystalline formation, yeah, it changes. Veda Austin has been really promoting this deeply and love her work. There's Bach flower remedies and even homeopathy, for instance, that looks at sort of the energetic quality of a healing herb or plant or medicine, and how that information can actually be transmitted through water. You talked about Dr. Pollack and the fourth phase of water and creating this exclusion zone, right? And I believe in one of his first experiments, he actually used infrared light to actually
Hmm.
stimulate. So there was an energy that was used to induce the fourth phase. Infrared light. What other energies do we know or not know that we are stimulated? That we can be stimulated with, or that we're exposed to, or that we can create a certain resonance within our own body to
Yes.
yeah, to allow the cerebrospinal fluid to go into this fourth phase. Now this hasn't been shown scientifically, but the hypotheses are there, right? They have to be. And so this is what I'm getting into, and seeing, how can we actually do this research on the cerebrospinal fluid. um, and so, so just imagine, right, that, um, it's 99% water. And now when I talk about water, I go from, okay, the cerebrospinal fluid is this totally crystal clear water, let's say 99% water with growth factors and hormones and glucose in it and things like that in the middle of your brain, right? But as that liquid component goes into the brain, and as that liquid component goes into the other tissues of the body, now, right, imagine this image of removing all of all of the tissues from your body and just being a water person, like what that would look like. And it would actually be exactly our structure. It would actually be like it would be our human, it would be the human body, right? So if there's any sort of if there's any sort of connection with water being able to transmit any energy, the cerebrospinal fluid is sort of in the perfect place, being 99% water, and being so connected to the brain and the spinal cord, that you could get direct energy transfer from, let's say we call it source energy, or any sort of energetic source that goes directly into the water of the cerebrospinal fluid. So we'll just call it the cerebrospinal fluid, but also the whole body. Okay. Um, and can transmit that energy directly. That
Mm-hmm.
we know, right? We know that the cerebrospinal fluid can transmit information just scientifically or medically, involved in vibration of the
Yes.
brain, revolved in movement of the brain, revolved in molecules of the brain, and involved in light transmission. So there are photoreceptors, and there's chemical receptors, and there's mechanical receptors that are perceiving what the information in the fluid is holding.
Yes.
So just taking one step less delineated, let's say, or less differentiated, and saying, wow, well, if it's already transmitting this information about movement and molecules and vibration and light, could it not be transmitting information about source energy or consciousness, or
Mm-hmm.
sort of that universal source to all beings? Could it not be actually the fluid of transmission through the cerebrospinal fluid and then to all the fluid in the body as a way of transmitting that energy? And so that's sort of the main hypothesis. We've put a few experiments together for, ions. We're looking at funding. Essentially, unfortunately, the grant wasn't approved, but we're still looking for, ways of testing this hypothesis from a let's say scientific perspective.
Oh, I
And
love it.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
so
I want to make two comments before you go on. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm totally nerding out here, Dr. Zapatera.
I love it.
Number one, you talked earlier about, the light, the light and energy it interacts with our body. We don't even need to have necessarily a molecule. I just want to make that clear to people that, like, when the sunlight hits our skin, it's not a physical thing that goes into our bodies, but yet our bodies tan or make vitamin D. Like that's just an example. There's another example. There's a little phototherapy patch that helps to reflect the infrared light and helps us make more GHK copper peptide, which we already make. Just it helps us make it more efficiently, and then it helps us with activating stem cells. But it doesn't go through the body, like it doesn't go through the skin. It's just light reflecting. So it's so cool, that we have these different technologies and things like that we can now test. So I'm super excited about your research. And then when you talked about, what would you, if you dissolved all the organs, right? What would you have left with water? I was going to say fascia. Because I believe, people say that skin is the largest organ in the body. And I always say, aside from water, I disagree. I think that fascia is the largest organ in the body because it touches everything. And when I have my conversations with source, oftentimes I end up with terminology that nobody uses, but for lack of a better term, fascial water. I'm like, okay, what's the big wig about fascial
Mm.
water? And it keeps giving me all these, intelligent downloads about the importance of the fascia and the fascial water and the information. It can actually store like tons and tons and tons of information in the fascial water. And then I got the message also, source codes being downloaded like this, and through for lack of a better word, using an old Ayurvedic type word, is the hara line, right? Like the power line that comes down through us. which then communicates to all the different chakras and things like that. So yes, I get the same message intuitively. Is like it does send information and communicates to all the other waters, of the body and all the other organs. So I'm just so excited that you're doing this research, Dr. Zapatera.
Yeah, thanks. Yep, yep. And you mentioned the hara, or the self. The thing about the fourth phase of water is that we see a lot of pictures of, like, self illuminated individuals, right? And to me, it's sort of like there's always a two-way highway. It's sort of like we're always connected, but there's also an internal illumination that occurs that then connects up as well. And so um,
Yes, good
one
point.
of the yeah,
Absolutely.
one of the hypotheses is essentially that when we're in that fourth phase of water, that with the exclusion zone informing the negative and positive charge, that's actually our internal battery, and that then creates the illumination from within. And so now there's this illumination from within. There's an illumination. There's an external illumination, and now it's just illuminated. And there are certain, let's say, states or resonances that may happen in. And so the hypothesis is does that happen with the water of the body going into the fourth phase, generating this internal battery that then
Mm.
can create illumination. So it's kind of cool. And then
It is cool.
I
And
just
we're
sort of
we're
say
told we're being, our light bodies, we're and a
exactly.
lot of it doesn't make sense to, it's like, well, we're in this dense physical form. How could we be in our light body? Like, are we going to disappear? Are people going to not see us? Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're told our DNA is crystal, and then we're actually a crystalline body, so there's all these confusing terms going around in the esoteric realms. But a lot of the people sharing about this are not scientists, right? So it's hard for somebody like me to translate that for people. Like,
Yep.
what does that really mean?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's super interesting what you have going on, and so you have that one study that or research that you would like to get funded, which sounds really, really, really interesting. Do you have other projects that you're looking towards working on related
Yeah,
to
we're
CSF?
looking at well, I mean, one of the compounds that we're looking at specifically is DMT, endogenous DMT, so
Hmm.
dimethyltryptamine.
Yep.
It's found in many, it's found in many plants and animal species. It's been used for millennia as sort of an entheogen for spiritual rituals, and it's found in, like, ayahuasca, the toad. It's like it's been used. Well, we actually have internal DMT, and its function is not yet known. But DMT has been found in high concentrations in the cerebrospinal fluid. Um,
Right,
it's
right.
also thought that it's secreted via the pineal gland. And so what
That
we're
would make
looking
sense.
at, what's that?
That would make sense
Yeah, so
to
what
me
we're
anyway.
looking at is essentially, trying to get funding to look at what is the role of endogenous DMT in the body, and we, people that have been doing these meditations or that have been activating their pineal gland or have a relationship with DMT for whatever reason, have been working with it and know that there are certain breathing techniques or pineal activation techniques that can actually, that you can increase the level of DMT. What we want to try to do is see, for instance, you mentioned Wim Hof, is can we do something like the Wim Hof breathing method and show that we can, what does, and just ask the question, what happens to the endogenous DMT when you do intense breath work? And that's one of the molecules that you would expect to change fairly rapidly.
Mm,
And some of the
wow.
studies that they've showed, like, well, people know about dopamine, but they don't really know about DMT. But DMT is actually present in the same concentrations in the brain as dopamine. We just,
Hmm.
we don't know.
We don't talk about it.
People don't talk about it, right? And so, I'm working with a group, DMT Quest, and we're looking at endogenous. How do we stimulate endogenous DMT? And again, the difficulty of a lot of this stuff is having a sensor that can actually detect what you're looking for. And the thing about DMT is is because it's either in the cerebrospinal fluid or in the blood, um, is that there are so when you're trying to detect something that might be in such small quantities, sometimes it's pretty difficult to do, especially
Yes.
when there's a ton of albumin or transthyretin or these other proteins that are so abundant that when you put them into your system, they essentially clog the system. And so
They're
what
so loud.
exactly, exactly. So we're actually looking to develop assays that can specifically detect DMT in really, really, really small quantities. And so, so first we need to detect the sort of, create the instrument that can detect it in small quantities, and then see, what are the fluids that we have access to? Because just like you started the thing, not many people would put themselves up to a lumbar puncture, for a study on the cerebrospinal fluid. So, can we get it from the blood? Can we get it from the urine? Can we see changes in other body tissues or fluids that are more easily accessible? And that's really one of the
Mhm.
challenges about the cerebrospinal fluid is it's really
Not
difficult to
accessible.
access, and there's a lot of risks with just accessing it as opposed to just a venipuncture, going to a phlebotomist and getting your blood drawn. And so, we want to first do no harm. So therefore,
Right.
that makes the studies really challenging. But
Yeah,
that's another.
absolutely. And every time we do any sort of invasive procedure, there can be an immediate energetic and biological change. And so it's like, okay, well, is there DMT up or down because you just had a poke and it's painful, right? Like
Exactly,
it can
exactly,
totally shift
exactly,
it. It's so difficult to
exactly.
do now. If you pee in a cup, probably, you're not going to get too emotional about that because it doesn't hurt. But same thing even with animal studies, right? Like I'm not necessarily pro to
No, yeah,
animal
you're
studies
so
that are
right on.
invasive,
Absolutely.
but it's like you could like they've shown in the studies where the two groups had completely different results, and they found out that in the hidden camera that the one lab tech was petting the
Oh, there you
rats,
go. There you go.
right? And they had completely different results. So and then anyway,
I love
and
it.
yeah, so it's really, really challenging. Now, I would imagine, okay, I'm getting nerding out here again. I'm imagining that even if you could get access to the cerebral spinal fluid or some other thing, that if you could match the resonance, so instead of actually measuring the biological material, but the level or amplitude of the resonance, so you have the resonance signature of the DMT that you're looking for, and then somehow being able to quantify the loudness, if you will,
Yes,
of that, then that would be kind of a less invasive eat potentially because the albumin, the collagen, it's not that signature. So you would
exactly.
be able to,
Spot on.
kind of hone in on the, can you tell I'm a kind of a nerd?
No, I love it. No,
Just
it's
a
I think
little.
that's exactly the path. Um, and then, for anybody that's asking, they're like, "Oh, well, have you ever sent Dr. Pollock the CSF?" So we have actually been in communication with Dr. Pollock many years ago, and we said, "Look, we'd love to test if the CSF can go into the fourth phase." And he said, "Okay, send me 300 milliliters of CSF." And
300 milliliters. Wow. Okay. That's a lot.
that's why. So,
Wow.
in you and I right now, we have 150 milliliters, and so, um, would we pool the CSF from, and then who would actually go through that? And so we
Exactly.
have thought, like I've been in
Oh,
communication with like the UCLA CSF, that they have like a whole like CSF repository.
oh,
We at Harvard, we have a ton of CSF. But again, it's like vials of 1 milliliter, right?
yeah.
So would we pool 300
Oh
mils,
my gosh.
300 people mils of CSF, and then we don't know the state that it was collected in. And
Right.
so there are a lot of just variables, and so we actually decided, I'm like, look, there's no way, first of all, that we can get that from one person,
Yep.
and it's just pooling it. Yeah, I just wouldn't trust the results from pooling it, and so 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 that's
Mm.
essentially, that's where we were at. But he was, he was pretty open to testing it, which I think was really cool. But we just weren't able to get the material. And then because it's human tissue, there's a whole bunch of like regulations with
Oh,
human tissues
yes.
and crossing straight lines. And his
Oh,
lab needs to
yes.
be approved for human tissues, and we need to be able to send it. And it just takes a lot of work to work with human tissues. And we want to be as legit as possible, so we haven't been able to do that study. And again, until the technology comes down that we can do that study with literally like 50 microliters, and I'm not even talking,
That's
I'm talking
tiny.
microliters, I'm talking not milliliters, I'm talking microliters.
Wow.
That's the level that we want to be able to do the studies, because we want to be able to reproduce them, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another thing that's kind of hampering it. But again, N of one, right?
Mm.
Be your own experimenter in essence, with some of these things, with breath work, or see how you feel internally. And I think, as you open up to the realm of the fluid and the realm of water, as your awareness opens up to that, see what happens, see what your experience is, and go with that, because that's pretty powerful and that's purely authentic, right? And don't like, to me it's sort of like, I think a lot of people sort of like are recreating experiences that they've heard others have or read in a book or something like that. um you know Really question that, right? Did I just well,
Adopt it.
Dr. Karen had this experience, so this is gonna happen to me. And oh well, right? Was that true? Was that true to you? Was that
Hmm.
really true? Was that authentically yours?
Right.
Um, and that to me is like, that's the most profound, because it's just sort of allowing the energy to work through you, and being that N of one, being that authentic inquirer.
I love it. And it's funny because I was just about to say, well, we should wrap up, and words of wisdom, you just gave it.
Yeah,
So
no, yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
that's
That'll be
perfect.
it. And go towards love, like whatever
Yes.
that means, not like romantic love or anything, but the universal, that universal love. If you have any questions, about it, go read All Love, my book. But
Yes,
sort
yes,
of
the
opening
three
yourself
books.
up to love.
And we would love to have you back to talk about, your three books for the kids, and then the one you did with your son as well. I am all one and all love, because I just, like I said, every time I say those three words, and then start getting a vibration in my body. And so your website for the research stuff is holdingspace.com, or does that include all of the
It
above?
includes everything.
Okay.
It's links to the books, but they're found on Amazon as well. So, and what we're looking for also through the website is if anybody has had any personal experiences with their own cerebrospinal fluid. We're
Hmm.
sort of collecting an experiential log of people that have connected with their cerebrospinal fluid. Send us your experience, right? Even if you're learning about it, and just opening your awareness to it. That's really why the website was started in the first place, is just bringing people's awareness to the cerebrospinal fluid, so you could believe nothing that we said today. That's perfectly fine. Just know that there is this fluid, and open your awareness to it, and that's it, and see what happens. And then send
Mm.
me your experience.
Oh, that's interesting. So I was curious whether you get a lot of, well, not a lot, but of people who are craniosacral therapists giving feedback yet? Not
No,
yet? Okay.
I mean, we get
Yeah.
people from all walks of life being like, I had a near death experience and was, this and this, or, I started after an injury, playing
Mm.
lacrosse, I felt this, and, I just started looking it up, and I found your, and it just, it like, my experience with the way that you're describing it physically just makes such perfect sense. And this was my experience with this, bubbling sensation of a fluid inside my spine, yada yada yada.
Fascinating. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, it's interesting just paying attention. I know, so some therapists are very good with their hand, not good with their hands, but well trained, so they can they can feel the pulse of, say, fascial fluid,
Yes.
and then they can feel the pulse of the CSF fluid, and they can feel the pulse of lymphatic fluid, and it's all slightly different. And so I'm not trained in that way, but I can, if I pay attention to the cerebral spinal fluid right now, I can feel the different quality
There you go.
of the pulse as opposed to when I pay attention to the rest of the water in my body. So that's just fascinating.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah, thank you so
Beautiful.
much. So, Dr. Zappaterra, thank you so much for joining us today. Love the work that you're doing. It's so exciting and breakthroughs. I love to connect with you again. Talk about your other books and the other work that you've been doing with your son and the other books. The I Am All One and All Love. I think I'm going to go to Amazon right now and get them for my nieces. I'm always gonna have an excuse to buy them consciousness related stuff. So this is great. Again, folks listening in, thank you so much for sharing your time with Dr. Zapatera and myself. Holdingspace.com is the website, and feel free to share that link with other people you think might be interested or have a personal experience and would like to give some feedback. That would be absolutely fantastic. Again, Dr. Zapatera, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Big love, big love.